He was a king who answered to no one. She was a village healer who answered to everyone. The sick, the dying, the mothers screaming through their worst hours. Their worlds should never have collided. But on the night she tore up her own marriage contract in front of 60 witnesses and walked into a blizzard alone, fate had other plans. He found her in an abandoned hut. No crown, no guards, no name exchanged. Just firelight. Just a woman who handed a stranger half her last piece of bread without asking who he was. And then, without knowing her name, without knowing her story, he made her an offer that would change everything. Why would the most powerful man in the kingdom choose a woman the world had just discarded? One can tear a piece of paper, but the sound of it breaking in a silent room, that cannot be undone. The snow had been falling since morning, soft and indifferent, dusting the roof of the village church in Vossmark the way it dusted everything else in this corner of the eastern borderlands. Without preference, without ceremony. Inside, 60 people had crowded into pews meant for 40, their breath rising in small clouds beneath the low stone ceiling. Tallow candles burned along the walls. Someone had woven winter berries into the altar arrangement, red against brown, which was festive if you didn't look too closely. Elara Voss stood at the notary's table in a dress the color of dried sage, gray-green, the color of her workroom, the color she had chosen without thinking much about it, because she had not been thinking much about the dress at all. She had been thinking about the formula for her father's cough tincture, about the Brennan twins' mother, who was 3 weeks from her due date and showing signs of early labor, about whether the road from Vossmark to the eastern ridge would freeze solid by nightfall. She had not been thinking about Sir Edmund Vale. He stood beside her now, adjusting his cuff, a gesture he made often, she had noticed, over the 18 months of their courtship, whenever he wanted to signal that his time was valuable, and he was graciously making an exception. His coat alone was worth more than everything in her father's apothecary. He smelled of cedarwood and deliberate expense. The notary read in the measured drone of a man who had done this many times and expected to do it many more. Elara heard the words without quite listening. Marriage contract, property acknowledgement, covenant of household. Standard language, the notary had assured them both at the preliminary reading. Standard language, nothing unusual here. He reached the 7th clause. Upon solemnization of the union, stewardship of Vossmark Field, designated herein as the Eastern Herb Parcel, 40 acres, borders enumerated in Appendix C, shall transfer in full to the household of Vale, to be administered under the authority of Sir Edmund and his heirs in perpetuity. Elara placed her hand flat on the table, not over the contract, just on the table. Her fingers spread against the cold stone, the way they spread when she needed to feel something solid beneath her before she made a decision. Vossmark Field. She saw it the way she always saw it, not as acreage or legal language, but as the smell of it in August. The soft rot of old leaves under new growth, her father's hands moving through the chamomile rows, with the patience of someone who understood that most things worth having required years of tending. 40 years he had worked that land. He had taken out 3 loans against it to buy medicines for patients who could not pay, and he had done it without telling her, because he knew she would argue, and he had not wanted her to carry the weight of the arithmetic. She turned her head very slightly and looked at Edmund. He was not looking at her. He was watching the notary's pen, following the final lines of the document with the expression of a man waiting for the last few seconds of something already decided. The satisfaction in his face was not the kind that came from love. It was the kind that came from a correctly executed plan. 3 coincidental questions, she thought. One about the field's eastern border. One about the soil composition. One, and this was the one she had dismissed at the time because she had not yet understood she should be paying attention, about whether the transfer of her father's land to a new household would require court documentation or merely notarial witness. She had answered all 3. She had drunk her tea and answered, and not understood. Elara picked up the contract. The room had been doing what rooms do when formal proceedings are nearly finished. Rustling, settling, preparing to applaud. It went still when her hands moved. Not because anyone understood yet, because something in the quality of her stillness made the air change. She tore the contract in half. The sound of parchment splitting in a stone room is not like the sound of tearing cloth or paper. It is sharper. It has weight. It lands in the silence the way a stone lands in still water, and the silence afterward is not the same silence as before. She tore it in half again. Then she set the pieces down on the table, edges unaligned, and stepped back. 60 people did not breathe. Edmund turned. She watched the sequence of expressions cross his face. Surprise, because he had not expected this. Confusion, because his mind was still processing. Then a calculation, sharp and swift, as he recognized the shape of what had just happened, and began measuring his options. The color that rose in his throat was not embarrassment. It was strategy. Elara. The word was a warning dressed as a name. Clause 7, she said. Her voice was the same voice she used when reading dosages. Level, without decoration. I will not sign Clause 7. You're making a scene in front of, I'm protecting my father's land. She looked at him the way she looked at a patient presenting symptoms she had already identified. Those are different things, Sir Edmund. He stepped closer. 2 inches, the kind of distance meant to remind her of height differential, of the difference in their social standing, of all the invisible architecture that had surrounded this arrangement from the beginning. Be reasonable. Your father's debt alone is between my father and the court. She did not step back. Whereas Clause 7 is between me and every person in this room who just heard it read aloud. The silence had changed again. 60 people who had come for a celebration were doing something different now. They were listening, with the particular attention that people give to a moment they know they will describe later. In the front row, Madame Rosa shifted in her seat. She was 70 years old, the village's eldest midwife, keeper of birth records and bloodline documents going back 4 generations. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her expression was the expression of someone watching something they have waited a long time to see. Elara walked to the door. Edmund's voice followed her, lower now, intended only for her. Tell them it was a change of heart. Personal reasons. I will not pursue the land claim through the courts. She stopped with her hand on the iron latch. Cold metal, real and certain. She looked back at him across the length of the room, across the notary's table with its torn parchment, across the candles and the winter berries, and 60 people pretending they were not leaning forward. Madame Rosa, she said clearly, still has the portion of the contract bearing Sir Edmund's signature. I imagine the village will be interested in reading Clause 7 in full. Edmund looked at Madame Rosa. Madame Rosa looked back at him, with the placid, unshakable expression of a woman who has witnessed 70 winters and is no longer capable of being threatened by anything a man in expensive clothing might do. Elara pushed open the door and walked out into the snow. Fate does not arrive in thunder. Sometimes it arrives as a stranger, who shields you from the wind without asking your name first. She made it 2 miles before the storm found her. She had known it was coming. She had read the sky that morning, the particular yellow-gray heaviness of it, the way the birches along the eastern ridge had gone still in that deliberate way that meant the air was holding its breath. She had planned to be home well before it broke. She had not planned on standing at a notary's table for 40 minutes while a man she had agreed to marry tried to quietly steal her father's livelihood. The wind came first, then the snow. Not the soft dusting of the morning, but something serious, something that leaned into her, found the gap between her collar and her jaw, and drove cold there. The road disappeared into white within minutes. She found the gamekeeper's hut by memory more than sight. She had delivered a baby here once, 3 winters ago, a difficult birth in the gamekeeper's wife's second labor. The hut had been abandoned since. The gamekeeper had moved his family south. But the structure was still sound, and someone had left a cord of dry wood stacked against the interior wall. The door was unlocked. Inside, a table with one leg repaired with rope, 2 chairs, an iron stove gone to rust, the wood pile, and a window on the east side through which the wind found enthusiastic entry around a gap in the shutter. She built a fire. She was good at fires, at most practical things, because practicality was what her profession demanded and what her upbringing had provided. Only when the first warmth began to push back against the cold did she notice her left hand. A cut along the base of her palm, 2 inches long, already dried to brown-black. She could not remember when it had happened. Perhaps the parchment's edge, perhaps the door latch. She had not felt it. She unpacked her medical bag. She always carried it, the same way she always carried the dried bread ration, the same way she checked the sky before leaving home, and began to wind a bandage around her left hand, using only her right. The result was technically adequate and visually inelegant. She studied it for a moment, then tightened the knot with her teeth. "Not your best work," her father's voice said, somewhere in the back of her mind. "No," she agreed silently. "It's not." She was sitting close to the stove when the knock came. Not a pounding, a knock. 3 measured raps, the kind made by someone who had been taught that one announces oneself before entering another person's space, regardless of how empty the space appears to be. She stood up, moved to the door, opened it. The man outside was very tall, which was the first thing she registered. The second was that his hair was dark and wet with snow, and his riding cloak, while clearly expensive, the wool was the right weight, the cut the right line, was not designed for extended exposure to this kind of weather. He had not planned to be out in it this long. The third thing she registered, reflexively, professionally, without deciding to. Lips, just beginning to show the pale undertone of chill. Fingers not yet stiff, but close to it. Not in danger, not comfortable either. His eyes were the color of steel worn smooth by use, silver gray and very still. He looked at her with the expression of someone unaccustomed to being looked at directly, and who was not quite certain what to do with it. "May I come in?" he asked. Elara looked past him at the snow, looked back. He was not feverish, not visibly injured, not carrying anything alarming. He had knocked. She stepped aside. "Sit near the fire," she said. "You can explain yourself afterward." He sat. He did not, she noticed, immediately try to fill the silence. Most people felt silence as a demand. He seemed to feel it as something else, a relief almost. They were quiet for a while, the two of them angled toward the stove, the wind making its case against the shutter. The fire was doing its work. She could see the tension in his jaw slowly releasing as the cold left him. She was aware of him the way she was always aware of a patient, tracking, cataloging, filing away small data points without conscious effort. The calluses on his right palm, visible when his hand rested open on his knee. Sword training, years of it, not decorative. The way he held his spine, not the forced straightness of someone performing dignity, but the natural alignment of someone who had been carrying weight for a long time and had simply adjusted to it. The faint line of a scar along his left thumb, curved in a way that suggested the bone beneath had still been growing when the wound was made. "You're a healer," he said. "Midwife and herbalist, village of Vossmark." She did not ask who he was. She would learn, or she wouldn't. He glanced at her bandaged hand. "You wrapped that yourself." "I didn't have another option." "Could I—" "I'm fine." She paused. "Thank you." He nodded, looked back at the fire. She had dried bread in her bag, the standard emergency ration, dense and tasteless, and exactly what the body needed when it was spending all its resources on warmth. She broke it in half, set one half on the edge of the chair nearest to him, without looking at him, without asking. He looked at the bread. She watched his expression, a flicker of something that crossed too quickly for her to name precisely, except that it sat somewhere in the territory between surprise and recognition. He picked it up and ate. "Today," she said, to the fire, because the fire would not have opinions about it. I tore up my marriage contract in front of the entire village. The man looked at her. Do you regret it? He asked the question the way she asked questions, like he actually wanted to know. She considered it genuinely. Through the window, she could see nothing but white movement. Inside, the fire made its quiet argument for warmth. Clause 7 would have transferred my father's land to my husband's family upon marriage. He's been farming that land for 40 years. She paused. He took out loans against it to treat patients who couldn't afford to pay. He never told me because he knew I'd argue. Another pause. I can't regret protecting it. He won't let this go easily. No. And what will you do? She looked at the fire. The question was real. She could feel the weight of it. She had approximately 7 hours of warmth, a long walk through a storm, a father who was getting sicker, a man who was now her enemy because she had refused to be his convenience, and no plan beyond the next few hours. I don't know yet, she said, but right now I'm warm. And that's enough for this moment. In her peripheral vision, something shifted in the man's face. Not pity, nothing so condescending as that. Something quieter. The recognition, perhaps, of someone who understood what it was to reduce the world to its most essential element and survive on that. He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes, she thought, were older than his face. Then Captain Rolfe's voice came through the door. Your Majesty. The word rearranged the room. She looked at him. He looked at her. She was running the last half hour through a different filter now. The bread, the directness, the way he had simply sat in silence without performing anything. And on this second pass, it read differently. He stood, moved to the door, turned back. Caspian von Krell, he said. I know the name. You didn't bow. I was processing information. She met his eyes. I apologize for the bread. I didn't know. It was the best meal I've had this week. He said it quietly, and the strange thing was that he was not lying. She could tell. She had spent 23 years reading the difference. An agreement made without love, but offered by the first person to ask, do you regret it, and actually want the answer. Rolfe was given instructions to wait. The fire had burned down to coals, the orange light going amber, then deep red, the shadows in the hut thickening at the edges. Caspian sat across from her at the table with the repaired leg, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. Not intimate, just physics. 2 bodies near a low fire in a cold room. I didn't know who you were, he said, when I knocked on this door. Is that good or bad? He considered it. I haven't decided. He told her not to impress, because he had learned that impressing people was something you could do or not do, and the truly useful ones were unaffected either way. But because he had decided in the last hour that honesty was the only strategy that made sense with this particular woman, he needed a partner. Not for love. He had had love 7 years ago, before he understood the cost of it. He needed it for the council, who were measuring his reign by the presence or absence of an heir, and for the political architecture that required someone beside him who could not be bought or moved. 3 days ago, he had withdrawn royal endorsement from Sir Edmund Vale's land claim against Vossmark Field. He had read Edmund's letter, its careful layering of suggestion and request, the land folded inside the marriage proposal, like a blade inside a gift, and he had made the endorsement disappear through the appropriate channels. He had not known a woman was already attached to the arrangement. So, I'm still collateral damage, she said. Just repositioned. You were collateral damage 40 minutes ago. Now you're a deliberate choice, if you agree. The fire made a sound. Elara watched it. The terms he offered were these. Vossmark Field under royal protection, untouchable by Edmund or any Vale successor. Her father's tax debt cleared. The cost of Aldrich Voss's medical treatment borne by the royal household. A genuine seat on the royal council as heelmaster. Not a ceremonial title, not an ornament, but a working position with authority over the kingdom's medical jurisprudence. and a 5-year dissolution clause, documented and guaranteed, because he was not in the business of trapping people. When he reached the part about her father's treatment, Elara looked away. Just for a moment. 1 second, perhaps 2. Her gaze going to the hut's far wall, to the dark gap where the shutter leaked. Something in her face went quiet in a way that was different from her ordinary quiet. Caspian saw it. He chose not to mention it. "I have conditions," she said when she looked back. "I'm listening." Her conditions were, she continued her practice, not as a hobby, not as a fond personal pastime, but as a formal professional function. The royal apothecary would be properly stocked, and she would have operational authority over it. No one would refer to her as a decorative companion, in private or in public. And, she held his gaze, she wanted to be present at the Winter Alliance Summit, where Sir Edmund Vale would also be present. Caspian looked at her for a beat longer than necessary. "You want a stage." "I want to make a statement." Different things. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, more the ghost of one. The suggestion that somewhere behind his careful expression a smile lived, and occasionally made itself almost known. "Agreed," he said, and extended his hand. She looked at it first. The palm was broad, the fingers long, the skin roughened at the pads from sword work. Along the base of his thumb, curving toward the wrist, ran a pale scar, old and well settled, shaped less like a line and more like a crescent. Her eyes tracked it without her permission. "That scar," she said. "It was from childhood." He looked at her with the particular expression of someone genuinely surprised, which, she suspected, did not happen to him frequently. "How do you know?" Adult scar tissue on the palm runs longitudinally. It follows the tension lines of a mature hand. That one curves. It formed while the bone beneath was still growing. She stopped. "I'm sorry. Occupational habit. I was 7, running from a calligraphy lesson. I fell onto the kitchen hearth." She looked up and found, unexpectedly, something warm in the silver of his eyes. Not warmth as she usually encountered it, which was performed and wanting something. This was accidental warmth, the kind that slipped out when a person forgot to maintain their architecture. "You used to run from lessons?" "I was a 7-year-old once." She put her hand in his. His grip was warm, warmer than the firelit room warranted, which meant his body temperature was still running elevated from the cold and the exertion of the storm. His thumb settled briefly over her wrapped palm, light as a consideration. He held the handshake 1 beat past formal. She noticed. She thought he noticed that she noticed. Neither of them said anything. "Caspian," he said, quiet, with some care around the word, "when there is no one else in the room." She stored the permission without examining it too closely. Outside, the storm was beginning to loosen its grip. Rolf's voice called the road was passable, the evening was waiting. The world, with all its arrangements and obligations and careful architectures, was waiting. She picked up her medical bag, to be tested not by questions, but by situations. Countess Isadora von Thal's residence occupied the northwest corner of the capital's old quarter, where the streets still ran along the original Roman grid, and the buildings were made of the kind of gray stone that had stopped caring about weather centuries ago. The library was larger than the receiving room. This, Elara would come to understand, was intentional. Isadora received her in the doorway herself. No servants, no ceremony, and looked at her for a long moment with eyes the color of old amber, assessing with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 3 decades in royal intelligence and never entirely left it. Her gaze settled on the bandage. "You dressed that yourself," she said. "Correct." "Take it off." Elara unwrapped the bandage. Isadora examined the cut, then rewrapped it herself, tighter, the pressure applied in the right places, 3 tucks that would not slip. She worked without gentleness and without unnecessary conversation. "Better," she said, stepping back. A healer who treats herself carelessly is a healer I won't trust. That was the welcome. What followed was 3 days of the most rigorous preparation Elara had ever experienced, which was notable given that her training had involved learning surgical anatomy from a textbook her father had copied by hand, and practicing sutures on raw pork in the cellar. On the first day, Isadora brought her to the doorway of Caspian's council chamber during an active session and told her to observe for 1 hour, then identify the most dangerous person in the room. Elara studied faces, body language, the choreography of who spoke and who listened, and who calculated while appearing to do neither. She named 4 of 5 correctly. The 5th, Isadora said. I couldn't place him. The man in the gray coat, 2nd row. That's me. I'm sitting in for Lord Verne, who is indisposed. Isadora's expression did not change. I was testing whether you would identify the observer. On the 2nd day, Isadora placed a letter on the table between them, unsigned, unaddressed, the wax seal already broken. Tell me whether this is genuine or fabricated, threatening or routine, and why. Elara read it twice. She caught 3 inconsistencies in the paper's fold pattern, consistent with a document handled many times before being deliberately recreased to appear fresh, and 2 phrases that echoed known Faction political language. She said so. Correct, said Isadora. You needed 20 minutes. That's too long? You should know inside 15 seconds. She refilled her own cup of tea. Practice knowing faster. On the 3rd day, Isadora walked her through the capital's central market, with no introduction, no guard, and no explanation. Elara moved through the stalls the way she moved through her village, stopping when she recognized someone's posture as the posture of someone in pain, asking a question here, offering an observation there, buying a handful of dried rose hips from a vendor who was clearly undercutting his supplier, and knowing it. 3 villagers found her for informal consultations. 2 noblewomen walked past her with the deliberate non-seeing of people establishing hierarchy. 1 man recognized her and chose to pretend he hadn't. She handled all of it without breaking her pace. Walking back, Isadora said nothing for 4 blocks. Then, adequate. From Isadora, this translated to something considerably warmer. Elara Voss arrived on the 2nd morning, not by his own transport, which he could no longer manage, but in a royal conveyance Caspian had arranged without being asked and without mentioning it. Elara heard the carriage wheels on the stone courtyard and was downstairs before the door opened, which meant she saw him from the top of the steps before he saw her, the familiar shape of him, reduced. He had lost weight since the last time she'd seen him, 3 weeks ago, and the cold was making him hold himself differently, protecting his chest the way a person does when breathing has become something that requires conscious management. He looked up and found her face immediately. You didn't send word, he said. Not accusation, observation. I know. She came down the steps. I'm sorry. Sit down. Here, come inside. Let me listen. He sat. He let her press the stethoscope to his back, to his chest, moving through the protocol with the patient compliance of someone who had trained his daughter and knew that the role reversal was complete now and was at peace with it. She listened. She moved the instrument. She listened again. Her face did not change while she worked. This was trained. This was years of learning that your face in the diagnostic moment belongs to the patient, not to you. The disease is progressing, she said when she finished, but slowly, and we have the means now to treat it properly. He looked at her with the eyes of her father, warm and specific in the way that parents' eyes become specific when they have known your face long enough to read every variation. Are you all right? I'm doing the right thing. That's not the same as being all right. She held his gaze. In the silence between them was everything they didn't need to say. The years in the apothecary together, their herb rows in the summer field, the way he had first taught her to listen to a patient's breathing, not as sound, but as information. I don't know yet, she said, but I'm learning. He put his hand against her cheek. One gesture, the kind that requires no translation. 40 minutes later, he emerged from Caspian's private study, with his spine an inch straighter than when he'd gone in. He looked up to the window on the east side of the corridor, because he always knew where she was in any building she occupied. This was a father's skill, not a man's, and found her there, her palm against the cold glass. He nodded once. Her eyes filled. She did not let the tears fall, not yet, not here. But she kept her hand on the glass until he was out of sight, and she understood, in the specific and wordless way that love makes itself known, that she had made the right choice. Meanwhile, in the eastern district of the capital, Sir Edmund Vale was doing what people who have lost control of a situation inevitably do. He was trying to reframe it. He began mentioning a delivery case, a difficult birth at the village of Bren a month prior. He did not say directly that Elara had been negligent. He did not need to. He spoke in the grammar of implication, the subjunctive of carefully placed pauses. One wonders, of course. One does not wish to cast aspersions, but the family, understandably, has questions. The child had been born at 24 weeks, one of two. Twins at that gestation, in that winter, without a hospital within 50 miles. No midwife on earth could have saved both. Elara had saved the mother, when 3 male physicians had already concluded the situation was beyond intervention and stepped away. But the mother's survival was not the part Edmund was telling. Lady Vivian Saxton heard the story at a dinner party 3 days after Elara's arrival in the capital. She was beautiful, in the way of things designed to be looked at. Precise, polished, always correctly lit. She had been Caspian's companion for 8 months, 2 years ago, before he had ended it with the particular cold courtesy that was, she had decided, his only real cruelty. She listened to Edmund's careful implication and thought, useful. No one saw a queen until she walked into the room. Isadora chose the color herself. Deep crimson, not the red of celebration, but the red of authority, of dried blood, of the kind of beauty that demands rather than invites attention. No decorative gems. Instead, around Elara's throat, a chain in black and gold. Old enough that the links had worn smooth, heavy enough to be felt, bearing the seal of the Royal Hellmaster, a title that had not been filled in 60 years. Not the badge of a wife. The badge of a function. Isadora looked at her for a long moment before stepping back. Then, with the economy of someone who did not distribute approval carelessly, they'll look for cracks, give them nothing to find. Elara looked at herself in the steel mirror, in the crimson, with the chain at her throat and her hair pinned back in a way that showed the line of her jaw. She looked like someone she was not yet entirely familiar with. This did not frighten her. She had felt unfamiliar with her own reflection before. The first time she had worn her father's apothecary coat. The first time she had made a decision in a delivery room that no one else would make and lived with the outcome. I am the heel master of the royal household, she said to the mirror, testing the weight of it. Cracks are what I repair in other people. Isadora, turning to go, almost smiled. The great hall of Krell Festung was lit by 12 bronze torches positioned along the vaulted stone ceiling, and by the collected candlelight of 300 people arranged in their carefully calibrated social geometries. 12 territories were represented. Old blood and new money and ancient grudges moved through the room in patterns that looked like socializing and were something else entirely. The herald's voice rose above it all. His Majesty Caspian von Krell, Alpha King, and Heelmaster Elara Voss of the royal household, his bond partner and Alpha Queen designate. Caspian stood at the head of the grand staircase. He was dressed in black and deep gray, the silver of his eyes the only brightness in his face. And he turned, a deliberate turn, calibrated, the kind of movement that sends a message to everyone watching, and extended his hand toward the archway. Elara stepped out of the shadow of the vaulted corridor and took it. The torchlight found the heelmaster's chain at her throat before it found anything else. 300 people processed the information in 3 seconds. The chain, the title it represented, the fact that she was standing beside him not as ornament, but as office. A woman in the third row, old, wrapped in sable, the widow of a council member from the previous reign, turned to her companion and said in a voice intended to be a whisper and pitched somewhat ambitiously, "Finally, he chose someone who does something." They descended the staircase together, and the room rearranged itself around them. Sir Edmund materialized at the edge of the corridor that led to the east reception room, precisely where the chandelier light thinned. He stepped forward with the confidence of a man who believed the world was still organized according to his preferences. He was not alone. Lady Vivian stood 2 paces behind him, in gold that caught every available light source, her expression composed into something that was not quite warmth and not quite disdain, but lived elegantly between them. "Elara," Edmund said it with the emphasis of someone accustomed to defining others through their relationship to himself. She stopped. She looked at him the way she looked at a set of symptoms, without malice, without theater, with the simple professional clarity of someone assembling a diagnosis. "Sir Edmund, how is the winter treating you?" "This situation," "Heelmaster Voss," Caspian said, and his voice did not rise, did not sharpen, did not perform authority in any of the ways that men who needed to prove authority usually did. It simply filled the space the way water fills a vessel, completely, without effort. "If Sir Edmund has questions regarding medical jurisprudence, I'll leave them in your hands." Edmund's mouth closed. Vivienne's voice came instead, smooth and precisely aimed. "Caspian, how long it's been. Does your little healer know which waters she's waded into?" Elara turned to her. 1 second of the diagnostic gaze, tracking the slight tension around Vivienne's temples, the careful way she held her shoulders, the too deliberate evenness of her breathing. "Lady Vivian, I've been told you've had persistent headaches for 6 months." A pause. The conversation around them had not stopped, but it had softened, the way conversation does when people near something interesting. "I have some, yes. I would be glad to consult after supper. No charge. I think the cause is treatable, and I'd rather you know than not." The silence that followed had a different texture than the silences that usually followed things said in ballrooms. Vivian looked at her with an expression that recalibrated slightly, moving away from something and toward something else. Then, genuinely, "I might take you up on that." Caspian guided Elara onward, his hand on hers where it rested in the crook of his arm. Not possessive, but present. A pressure that said, "I am here, and I am paying attention." After a moment, quietly, "Stress was a diplomatic diagnosis." "I didn't diagnose, I asked a question." He glanced sideways. The ghost of that almost smile returned. "The arrangement functions. The heart does not honor arrangements." The royal apothecary, when Elara first took possession of it, had been a cold room full of dusty jars and the ghost of someone's much older intentions. 3 months later, it was something else. Shelved in order by family, then by function, then by preparation form. Lit by 2 additional lamps, warmed by a small iron stove she had requisitioned through Rolf, who had looked at the request for approximately 2 seconds before signing it, and smelling, persistently and inevitably, of dried herbs and camphor, and the particular mineral undertone of a workroom where things were actually being done. Caspian appeared in the doorway one morning without knocking. She was sorting a delivery of winter bark, stripping and classifying, her fingers moving through the familiar motions without requiring much of her conscious attention, which meant her conscious attention was occupied with working through a dosage question that had been nagging at her since the previous evening. Her hair was pinned up with a piece of linen thread. Her apron had a stain along the left side that she had noticed and not yet addressed. She looked the way she looked when no one was watching. He stood in the doorway and said nothing. She became aware of him after 2 minutes, registered the particular quality of the silence, the way it was occupied. She turned. "Do you need something for a headache?" "No." "Something to help with sleep?" "No." Then what do you need, Caspian? He looked at her, at the workroom, at her hands, at the ordered rows of jars she had built from the dusty chaos, and he said, "A room where no one is waiting for me to be anything in particular." She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the bark and continued sorting. She did not offer him a chair. He found one himself, pulled it to the corner of the work table, and sat. The room was quiet except for the stove and the sound of her work. He stayed for 45 minutes. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them felt the need to. It was, she thought much later, the most honest 45 minutes she had spent with another person in years. Vivian came 3 days later, as promised. Elara conducted a proper examination. Blood pressure approximated by pulse and color, sleep habits mapped through careful questioning, diet assessed by the patience of someone who had learned that people tell you the truth about what they eat only if you wait long enough and don't seem to be judging. She confirmed, not a mysterious chronic ailment. Insufficient sleep, irregular nutrition, and, said with clinical neutrality, the consistent structural compression of a corset worn 8 to 10 hours a day. "I'll give you a written recommendation," she said. 3 full meals, 8 hours of sleep, and if you are wearing a corset, remove it for at least 6 hours a day. Your body is not getting enough room to breathe. Vivian looked at her across the examination table. "You haven't asked about Caspian." "No. We were Lady Vivian." Elara met her eyes. "Whatever you and His Majesty had before the terms of my arrangement, that is a matter for the two of you. I am your physician at this moment. That is the only role I hold with you." A long pause. Outside, the capital's midday bells were making their usual argument about the hour. "You're stranger than I expected," Vivian said finally. "You're not the first person to say that." Something shifted in Vivian's face. A small, private adjustment. The kind that happens when a person reclassifies something. She took the written recommendation. At the door, she paused. "For what it's worth," she said, and for the first time her voice was without any of its usual weaponized precision. "He looks at you differently than he looked at me." Elara said nothing, but she did not look away either. Marta was 19 years old, sent by Isadora with the official designation of lady's maid and the unofficial designation of additional eyes. She was efficient and quiet, and had initially treated Elara with the careful politeness of someone not yet sure which way a situation was going to go. Over 3 months, the careful politeness had become something else. Not declared loyalty, but the practical loyalty of someone who has watched a person make decisions under pressure and decided that this is someone worth staying near. She began anticipating Elara's needs before being asked. She stopped knocking before entering. She started, small and cautiously, offering opinions. It was Marta who brought the package in on the morning it arrived, her face paper white, holding the box at a slight distance as though it might act on its own. Inside, a dried sprig from Vossmark field. Elara recognized the species immediately, the smell of home and her father's work. And a letter. The handwriting was educated, but the words were not sophisticated in the way of someone trying to impress. They were sophisticated in the way of someone who had thought carefully about how to cause the most precise pain. "This land will return to its rightful steward, when the bond dissolves or when the father no longer requires medicine." Elara read it twice, put it down on the work table, looked out the window at the gray sky above the capital's rooftops. "Where is my father?" she asked. "East guest wing. He had his morning tea and was resting. Post 2 guards at his corridor. Tell them it's a medical protocol. His lungs require monitoring." Which was true. It was also not the only reason. She picked up the letter again. Caspian was 3 hours into the northern border vote. 6 months of political work converging in a single session. If she sent for him now, he would come, and his absence would register on the tally, and the men who opposed him would win the vote, and they would know exactly how they had won it. "Marta," she said. "Find me everything we have on Count Aldous Farron's trade associates in the Eastern Quarter." Marta's eyes widened slightly. "Now?" "When you're ready. Please." She found the delivery man through Isadora's network, cross-referenced with a clerk in the customs office she had been cultivating carefully. Not through money, but through genuine interest. Because he had a respiratory problem she had identified at a dinner 4 months ago and followed up on twice. The delivery man had been hired through an intermediary. The intermediary operated out of a tavern near the southern pier. Elara went herself. This was, she would acknowledge later, the place where she miscalculated. She went because a guard escort would signal arrival to anyone watching, and anyone watching would know the information she needed would disappear. She went in her plainest coat, with her medical bag as cover. She went because she was, in her professional life, accustomed to entering rooms that felt unsafe and remaining steady. The first meeting was fine. She gathered what she needed. The second meeting was not fine. Someone had talked between visits. When she arrived, the quality of attention in the room had changed, and she recognized the change. She had seen it in delivery rooms, the specific shift in atmosphere that preceded something going wrong. She sat very still. She drank the tea she was offered, because refusing tea in this context would be a provocation, and she needed time. She calculated her options. She waited. Rolf arrived 40 minutes later with 6 men. Caspian had finished the vote and asked for her location, and Rolf had known something was wrong by the answer he received. The 2 men guarding her door looked at Rolf's 6 and made the sensible decision. In the carriage back, Rolf said nothing to her. This was, she understood, not agreement with what she had done. Caspian's study at night, the fire fully stoked, the walls lined with maps he had looked at so many times, he no longer needed them. The single lamp throwing a warm, uncertain light across the desk. "You went alone," he said. "A guard escort would have warned them." "You were held for 40 minutes. "I was detained, not threatened. There's a difference. And I was drinking tea." "Elara." He said her name differently than he said everything else. Not softer exactly, more precise, like he was using it correctly for the first time. "Someone threatened your father." She looked at him. "I know. That is why I needed the evidence before you heard about it." "Why?" "Because the vote was today, and if I had told you, you would have come home." He was quiet for a long time. He stood and went to the window. The city's night lights, the snow falling again, the dark, reliable shape of the outer walls. He stood with his back to her long enough that she could read the quality of his silence. He was not angry. He was dealing with something more complicated than anger. "You could have been hurt," he said, still not looking at her. "I wasn't. That's not the point I'm making." "I know what point you're making." "I chose your border vote over my own safety, Caspian. I would make that choice again." He turned. In the lamplight, his eyes were not guarded in the way they usually were, the careful silver stillness that she had learned to read as control rather than coldness. There was something underneath it tonight, visible through the crack that a long day and a genuine fright had made in the architecture. "We leave for Krell North at dawn," he said. "The capital has too many eyes." "To protect the investigation." "Yes." Then, quieter. "And other things." She looked at him for a long moment. His face was hard to read, as it always was, except that she had been reading it for 3 months, and she had begun to understand which silences meant distance and which meant the opposite. She did not push. She waited. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "The northern road is long." She stood, collected her things, moved toward the door. Paused. "The vote," she said. "Did we win?" Something crossed his face. Surprise, then something warmer. "By 4 votes." She nodded, went to bed. Slow burn is experienced through the body, the heartbeat, the temperature of skin, the significance of 40 centimeters. In the carriage north, they sat across from each other for the first 2 hours in the comfortable silence they had developed. The silence of two people who had learned each other's rhythms and no longer needed to perform ease, because they had arrived at something like the real thing. She was reading. He was looking out the window, which he did approximately once every 15 minutes, a pattern she had charted without deciding to. "You keep checking the window," she said. "Habit. The habit of someone watching for something." He turned from the glass. His eyes met hers. "And you've been watching me." "Professional habit." "What do you see?" She put down her notes, looked at him, properly. 3 months of observation, organized and filed without her quite realizing she was keeping records. "Someone trying not to let me see something," she said. He didn't answer. But he didn't look away either, and in the space of that held gaze, something moved, a small tectonic adjustment in the territory between them. They were interrupted by the world. The bridge came apart with the controlled percussion of something planned rather than accidental. Not the chaos of collapse, but the deliberate architecture of an ambush, timed and positioned. The carriage lurched. Then the road was not where it had been. What followed was the violence of a situation that does not wait for readiness. The carriage at an angle, then Rolf's voice, clear and commanding. Then the cold air and the white ground, and the sounds of men who had been waiting in the tree line. Caspian was out of the carriage before she had fully registered that they had stopped moving, his hand finding her arm, steadying, a reflex that was not about strategy. She registered the attackers the same way she registered any emergency. Fast, categorized, filed into actionable information. She did not have a sword. She had a surgical kit, 13 years of anatomy training, and the practical knowledge that most human bodies, when correctly pressured at the right location, make decisions involuntarily. When a man came at her from the left, she moved in the way that surprises people who expect a healer to back away. She moved toward him, got inside his arm's reach, and applied pressure with 2 fingers to the cluster of nerves behind his ear and below his jaw. He sat down. He would stand up again in a few minutes. She would be gone by then. From 20 feet away, between 2 engagements, Caspian saw her. His mind filed 2 things simultaneously, the way minds do in combat. Threat at 3 o'clock, and, in a different register entirely, quieter and more surprising. She's all right. The aftermath. Thinning silence. Snow settling back into the spaces disturbed by the fight. Rolf doing the count that good captains always do. Caspian was standing 3 paces away when she crossed to him. He had a cut along his left arm, not deep enough for real danger, but open and bleeding through his sleeve, with the patience of a wound that will not close on its own. She was already opening the medical bag she had pulled from the carriage before climbing out of it. Habit. 20 years of habit. "Sit," she said. He looked at the tangle of shrubs and snow available for sitting. "There," she said, pointing at a boulder that protruded through the white. He sat. She cut the sleeve along the seam rather than pulling it. Less movement, less pain, better access. The wound was clean, the edges even enough for closure. She worked in the methodical silence of someone who had done this in worse conditions, with worse light and fewer supplies. "Steady breathing," she said without looking up. "Not holding it. If you hold it, the wound bleeds more." "You're giving me instructions about breathing." "I'm asking your body to cooperate with my work." She blotted the cut with a clean cloth. "They're different things." He complied. She felt the pattern of his breathing shift, deeper, more deliberate, the held tension in his ribcage releasing. She could hear the change. She was close enough to hear it. The wound cleaned, the pressure applied, the first strips of bandage in place. She worked carefully. The light was poor, the setting impractical, the cold making her fingers less precise than she wanted them to be. She compensated by slowing down. When the last knot was tied, she checked her work. Pressed one finger gently along the edges of the bandage to verify the pressure was even. Her hand was still on his arm. She had finished the work. She was confirming what she already knew. She was not, she acknowledged privately, in a hurry to move. The gap between her face and his was 30 centimeters. Less than that, actually. She had leaned in for the final check and not leaned back. "Elara," he said, "the wound is stable." "I know." I wanted to say something else. She looked up. 30 centimeters. His eyes at this distance were not the controlled silver she knew from across rooms and council tables. They were something else. Open in the way of a thing that has run out of the energy required to be closed. "When the carriage went over," he said, as though finding the words required the same care as finding footing on uncertain ground. "I was not afraid of the fall. I was, Your Majesty," Rolf's voice carrying from the tree line. "The northern station is 2 miles ahead. Men are ready." Caspian stopped. Elara did not move for a moment. She could feel the sentence he had started hanging in the cold air between them, unfinished, exactly the shape of something important. She stood. He stood. Her hand had to leave his arm. She gathered the bag. He helped her with her footing on the iced ground, hand on her elbow, then hand in her hand as they moved across the uneven snow, because the ground was treacherous, and he did not let go. They walked 30 meters like that, hand in hand, neither of them commenting on it, neither of them releasing it. "What were you going to say?" she asked. Not the right moment. But not finished. He glanced sideways, and in his profile she could see it, the thing he was still carrying. "Not finished," he agreed. "The best trap is one the enemy walks into of their own choosing." They returned to the capital 7 days later, after the trail from the attack had been followed to its source, and the source had been documented. Farron's handwriting was not in the attack orders themselves. Men like Farron did not make that mistake. But his seal appeared in correspondence recovered during the search of an associate's premises, and the associate, when presented with the recovered correspondence and a clear accounting of his legal position, became cooperatively informative. The council session convened in the main chamber at the 3rd hour of morning. Elara wore ivory and a ruby ring, not the simple bond ring of the arrangement, but the Hellmaster's stone, deep red, carved with the caduceus seal. Caspian wore his arm bandaged still, the white linen visible at his cuff, and he had worn it deliberately. The kind of deliberate choice that sends a message without requiring words. They tried, and we are here. Count Aldous Farron sat across the council table, with the expression of a man who has spent 20 years being the most dangerous person in most rooms, and has not yet accepted that this room might be different. He looked at the ledger open before him. His eyes moved to the relevant pages. She watched him count, the specific, unconscious arithmetic of someone checking how much had been found. She wrote on a small piece of paper and slid it across the table to Caspian, keeping the motion below the table's edge. "Ask him about pages 14 through 17. Caspian read it without looking at her. Without any change in expression, he turned to Farron and said, "The Commission has particular interest in pages 14 through 17. Your response?" Farron's pause lasted half a second, perhaps less. But in a room full of people trained to read the silences between words, it was enough. He had looked down at those pages in the first 30 seconds of the session. A quick, involuntary check, the kind of check people make on the thing they most want to confirm or deny. She had watched his eyes. The pages he feared most were not the ones with the most obvious evidence. They were the ones that linked the financial transfers to a name. She had used the observation the only way it was useful, as a key. The session proceeded. Farron's composure lasted another hour before it did not. When Farron had been remanded and the chamber had cleared to the necessary few, Caspian looked across the table at Elara and said, "Edmund is yours, if you want him." Not an order, not a gift. A question, phrased as permission. She looked at him for a moment. Then she stood. Sir Edmund Vale had positioned himself near the south wall with the careful nonchalance of someone hoping to be included in the resolution without having been officially named as part of the problem. He watched her cross the room toward him. She did not approach him the way she approached a confrontation. She approached him the way she approached a patient, directly, without theater, caring what was necessary. She placed a document on the table. "Sir Edmund has told a story," she said, and her voice was the voice she used in difficult deliveries, because decoration would be a disservice to the truth. "About a birth in the village of Bren. He has implied negligence." She looked at the document. "This is the full case record, signed by Madame Rosa, who assisted, countersigned by 2 additional witnesses." She met his eyes. "The mother survived. I maintained her life after 3 physicians had already stepped back from the room. The child, one of 2 twins, born at 24 weeks in winter, could not have been saved by any practitioner alive. That is not a failure. That is the edge of what medicine can do." Edmund's face was doing several things. "The land," she continued, "that you wanted through Clause 7, you won't have it. That is settled. I will not call for a sentence. The council has that authority, and I will not appropriate it." She picked up the case record. "But everyone in this room has now read the record. That is what I came to ensure." She set the document on the council table, in the center, where it would need to be formally filed. She sat down. In the silence that followed, the fire in the council's hearth was the only thing with anything left to say. What was interrupted in the snow? It finds air, finally. The chamber emptied slowly, the way rooms empty after formal proceedings. Reluctantly, with lingering, the occupants checking over their shoulders as they go, as though something might still happen that they would want to have seen. It was only the fire left, burning low, the torches guttered to a few that remained. The light was amber and uneven, and it threw the room's shadows long. Caspian sat, not in his council chair, but on the stone bench along the south wall, the informal posture of someone who has let a very long day finally land. The bandage on his arm was clean still. His shoulders were down. Elara sat beside him, not across, not at the appropriate formal distance. Beside. The decision was small and not commented on, and meant something, the way small spatial decisions mean things when they occur between people who have learned each other's language. The fire settled. The room breathed. "There's something I stopped saying," he said. "On the road, in the snow." She waited. "When the carriage went," he said. And his voice was the voice of someone who has spent so long being precise in public that finding a different register requires actual effort, and was making it. "I was not afraid of falling. I have fallen before. What I was afraid of was the possibility that I had not said something I should have said." The fire spoke. Nothing else did. "I have governed on the principle that power outlasts feeling, that a person who calculates well will outlast a person who feels deeply. You are the first person who has made me understand I was wrong about this, not by arguing the point, but by simply being in the room." He looked at her. "You gave half your bread to a stranger in a hut without asking who he was. You saved my arm in a snowstorm and tried to protect my vote while doing it. You walked into a dangerous tavern to protect my border and did not ask me to know about it until you could show me it had worked." He stopped. "That is not the behavior of someone fulfilling an arrangement." Elara looked at the fire, then at him. At this distance, 20 centimeters, 15, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw held tension even at rest, the particular way his breathing had changed in the last few minutes. She had been reading his body for months. She knew what changed breathing meant. "I love you, Elara," said plainly, without performance, the way a person says something when they have finally stopped trying to package it into something more manageable. "That is the thing I needed to say." She looked at him. She had diagnosed grief and fear and deception and desire in people who had been actively trying to conceal all of those things. And what she read in his face now, in the silver of his eyes, in the set of his jaw, in the unconscious lean of his body toward her, was not dressed up in anything. It was simply true. And that, the simplicity of it, was what she had not quite let herself believe until now. She smiled. Not the composed expression she wore in council chambers, not the professional warmth she offered patients. Her actual smile, the one that narrowed her eyes and made the controlled plane of her face briefly unrecognizable to anyone who had only met her in formal context. "I love you too," she said, "and I knew you would say it before I did, because you tell the truth earlier than you think you do." He looked at her. "I don't say things early. You tried to tell me in the snow. That was different circumstances. You also told me the bread was the best thing you'd eaten all week, when we had known each other for 40 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. "That was true." "I know. That's how I knew." He looked at her for a long beat, and then, slowly, in the way of someone who has been careful for a very long time and has decided to stop, he reached up and touched her face. His hand was warm, the scar on his thumb against her cheek, and she turned her face very slightly toward it, which was its own kind of answer. "The arrangement," he said, "needs to be revised." She finished it for him. No dissolution clause. No 5-year term. Just this. She leaned in. She let him. She leaned in too, which made it mutual, which was, she thought, in the last quarter second before the distance closed entirely, exactly right. The fire in the hearth burned low and gold, and outside, the capital's first spring snow of the season drifted past the high windows, and neither of them was paying attention to any of it. Love is not promised, it is only built, each day, from what is true. The apothecary in the spring was a different room than the apothecary in winter. Lighter. The windows open to the courtyard where the first herb beds Elara had established were putting out new growth, the air carrying the green bitter smell of things coming back. She had the Vossmark field harvest on the work table, sorted by species and date, the careful work of autumn preserved in paper and dry dark glass. She heard his footsteps in the corridor before he arrived. She had learned the particular rhythm of them 3 months ago, not quite even, the left heel coming down a fraction of a second before she expected it. From an old sparring injury he had never mentioned and she had never asked about directly, because there were some kinds of knowing that worked better without words. He appeared in the doorway without knocking. He had stopped knocking 4 months ago, which she had noticed and not commented on and considered significant. He was carrying a small box, carved wood, a trailing herb motif on the lid. He set it on her work table. She looked at it, opened it. Inside, dried sprigs, carefully packed, chamomile and yarrow, and the particular variety of meadowsweet that grew only along the eastern edge of Vossmark Field. She lifted a sprig, and the smell was exact. Her father's workroom, August mornings, the specific quality of growing up in a place where things were cultivated with patience. She didn't speak for a moment. "Do you know what any of these are?" she asked. "No. You bought something you couldn't identify." "I bought something you'd want." He said it with the same equanimity he brought to everything. Not defensive, not performing generosity, just straightforward. "The categories are different." She looked at him. He was standing at the edge of the work table in the morning light, his cuffed sleeve pushed back, the healed scar on his thumb catching the sun. And he was watching her with the particular expression he had, the one that still appeared occasionally, without his permission, the one she had first seen in a firelit hut 8 months ago when she had handed him half a piece of bread. She looked back down at the box, returned to the herb she had been sorting before he arrived. But the corner of her mouth had moved, and she didn't try particularly hard to stop it. He pulled his chair to the edge of the work table, the same chair, the same position as the first morning he had sat in her workroom in silence, and sat down. The apothecary was quiet, except for the courtyard sounds and the work of her hands and the unhurried, inhabited silence of two people who had learned each other's rhythms and found them compatible. Neither of them needed to say anything more. In the village of Vossmark, in Madame Rosa's archive, there is a folded piece of parchment. It is the portion of a marriage contract bearing one man's signature. Beside it, in her handwriting on a separate paper, she tore it in exactly the right place. Madame Rosa had written, "No further explanation was considered necessary." The story they tell about the Krell reign in the years that follow is not the story of border negotiations or territorial consolidations or political alliances, though those were real and lasting. It is the story of a village healer who tore a contract in front of 60 witnesses and walked into a snowstorm. Of a king who knocked on a stranger's door because it was the courteous thing to do. Of half a piece of bread, given without asking. And of a bond written without clauses, because the people who made it had already decided that honesty was worth more than safety, and love, when it is real, does not require terms.